We all know who I am. I wrote this book. My name is Joseph Kakwinokanasum. And yeah, I wrote this 2022, published, and it started off as a memoir. And when I got the opportunity to, when I got the nod from a publisher and they asked me what I was working on, I showed them, and then they asked, oh, well, they saw it, they read it. They asked me if I was ready to work on it, and at the time, I wasn't ready because I'd been working on it for 5 years, and it was just too much emotional investment, and I was already emotionally bankrupt at that time. So they recommended just basing a fiction on one of the memories that I had as a child, and the memory that I chose from the memoir was when I was about 10 years old, I found a bag of marijuana. And back then, marijuana was really illegal. It was 1979. But it was also really expensive, and we were really, really poor. And so, I learned how to, it's all in a book. But I'm not gonna, the reason why I'm telling you this is because the kid, Hunter, the protagonist, he's a very resourceful young kid. He knows how to make a dime. He knows how to work hard, and he knows how to get people to kind of follow him and his ways. And so I debated whether or not I was going to split this up and just read 5 or 10 minutes, but I decided, to hell with it. I'm going to read a full 15 minutes. So please bear with me. This is kind of what I'm going to, Anyways, 1979 was the year Hunter learned not to miss his mother. Spring marked the beginning of the high point of Margaret's increasingly long absences. The problem was, the longer she was gone, the more likely she was to show up at the worst time. Margaret was on a drunk. It had been 5 days. Hunter, Jacob, and Eric, his 3 friends, were hanging out in the basement. It was cool and out of the way of Deb and her friend Anita, Eric's older sister. The girls were sitting upstairs, drinking tea and listening to records. "Why don't we try a Kool-Aid stand?" Eric asked. He was a year younger than Hunter, as was Jacob. They were in the same class because Hunter had failed his first year in Red Rock. Eric had big blue eyes and a small mouth and a tomato soup stain over his top lip. Hunter looked at him. "With what, genius? Buttons and a smile?" "Well, I'll ask my sister to give me some money." Jacob shrugged his shoulders, and a smile formed large dimples in his round cheeks. And Eric noticed. "What's so funny?" "Like your sister will give us money," Jacob said. His dark eyes were wet, obsidian-like. He was a full-blooded Cree Nation, and the only one of the 3 boys born in Red Rock. Eric stood with his round belly stuck out and his t-shirt stained with milk from his breakfast cereal. "Just watch." He crept up the stairs to the kitchen. Deb and Anita were planning something. Eric was an intrusion. Jacob and Hunter peeked around the corner of the living room as Eric negotiated the terms of a $5 short-term business loan. "You know, more than half the businesses in the food industry fail within the first 6 months. Hunter and Jacob had heard Deb say. "Well, who told you that?" asked Eric. "Our consumer ed teacher," said Anita. "Consumer ed?" "Education. It's a class we take in school," Anita said, handing Eric a $5 bill. "Interest, kid. I want $6 by the end of the month." Eric walked towards his friends, a big smile on his face. The boys rode their bikes to McDonald's Market to pick up drink crystals and sugar. It was not yet noon, and even though it was only May, they all broke out in a sweat from the short ride, especially Eric. He dismounted his bike and swung a pudgy leg over the long seat of his motocross. It was the kind of bike that looked like a motorcycle and weighed a ton. They leaned their bikes against the outside wall, stacked one next to the other. Inside the store, it was clean and cool. The sweat on Hunter's back gave him shivers. McDonald's had the best selection in Red Rock, but it was owned by the family of Hunter's former teacher. His first term at Red Rock, Miss McDonald had called him a dumb Indian because he'd failed a spelling bee. That same term, Hunter asked a classmate for a pen, and Miss McDonald had slapped him across the face. "You speak English when you speak," she hissed. She pulled Hunter off his chair and sat him up on her desk. "I'll teach you to speak when I'm talking." Miss McDonald grabbed a thick red rubber band. "Show me your tongue." "No." Miss McDonald dug into Hunter's mouth. Her long, pink-painted fingernails scratched and cut his pressed lips. The two struggled in front of the class until Hunter spat on her. She swung at him, and with an open hand, and he dodged it. With one hand grasped onto his shirt collar, she reached for her yardstick. "I'll teach you to come to class unprepared," she said, and broke the yardstick over his back. The class gasped collectively, but Hunter didn't feel the pain. He struggled as she picked him up by the ear, her claws digging into his flesh. He felt warm blood trickle down his neck as she forced him to the principal's office. Hunter received a week of detentions for assaulting his teacher and a licking from his mother. At the end of the school year, Miss McDonald had written in his report, "Hunter is an irretrievable misanthrope. He will repeat grade 3. He'd been mortified, afraid to show his mother, knew how she would react. She'd beat him with her fists, whip him with an electrical cord. It'd be just another excuse to call him a stupid half-breed, an embarrassment to the family. His mother made Hunter feel a complicated mix of shame, guilt, and anger, all held together by the worn threads of a familial obligation. Miss McDonald was manning the register when they pulled up to the counter with 4 packs of assorted Kool-Aid and a bag of white sugar. She smelled of Bengay, that citrusy antiseptic smell that burned and cooled at the same time. Eric pulled out his money and slapped it on the counter with authority. Miss McDonald's pale, wrinkled hands with their large, protruding veins shook as she counted up the goods. Then, like it was a pop quiz in school, said, 15 cents times 4 plus $1.25 is? Eric let out a deep sigh. "Look, lady, do you want my money or not?" He straightened up, puffed out his chest, and with all the entitled defiance of a spoiled 11-year-old boy could manage, gave Miss McDonald an electric blue stare. Jacob and Hunter stood by, expectant. Eric often got away with things that would get the two native boys a slap. "Not with that attitude, young man," Miss McDonald pointed at Eric. Her thick cat's eye glasses steamed up, her whole body shaking. She looked like a snake ready to strike. Eric put the money back in his pocket. "You're not the only store in town, you know." He turned around and Hunter and Jacob followed. When Eric reached the door, he added loud enough so that she could hear, "It's school holiday, for sakes. Christ, who does she think she is?" "Blasphemer!" she yelled. "And don't come back." Outside, Hunter smirked as Miss McDonald, through the open door, glass door, emboldened by Eric's defiance, she marched up and slammed it shut. Hunter turned to his friends as they retrieved their bicycles. "Oh, man, that was so boss. Did you see the look on her face?" The boys mounted their bikes and rode a block away to the other store in Red Rock, the Four Corners Confectionery. It could have been on the set of an old black and white Western. Its contents and the people who owned it looked ancient. It was owned by an old man Bauer and his wife. Through the single-pane windows, Hunter could see 2 big German shepherds standing guard and a lazy calico cat sleeping on a shelf of dusty canned goods. the faded white exterior paint peeled and curled chips, flecks littering the ground like dandruff, exposing the weather-boned gray wood underneath. "Better leave this one to me, boys," said Eric. "Adolf's a Nazi." Well, the boys didn't know it for sure, but it was no secret that the Bauers didn't like natives. A rumor has it in the village that Miss Bauer would rip off anyone and spit at anyone who didn't look white. "Meet you at the museum." Eric leaned his bike against the store. Jacob and Hunter sat on a mixed patch of dandelions and crabgrass, waiting in the shade. 5 minutes later, they heard Eric riding down the back alley, whistling a tune. He dropped his bike to the ground and held up a small paper bag. "What a rip-off! 25 cents each! I got red, blue, green, and purple. Oh, and I couldn't afford sugar. So I bought us some candy instead." Well, it didn't make good business sense, but no one argued. "I'm sure we have white sugar at my place," said Hunter. They always had a big bag of it in the house that never seemed to run out, no matter how short of things they were on other. "Well, it looks like we're set then," said Jacob. And as they rode back over the hard pan washboard, their voices shook as they talked about the plan. "What are we going to do with all the money we make?" asked Hunter. And Jacob had a sweet tooth. "If we make any money, we'll blow it on candy." "We should think about buying some ammo for the cap guns," said Eric, always practical. Yes. "Sky's the limit, boys," said Hunter. They didn't talk about paying back the loan to Anita. At Hunter's, they laid their bikes down on the lawn and barged through the front door and ran down the stairs to the basement. Some old camping gear was piled under the basement steps, and Hunter dug out a 5-gallon thermos jug to hold the water. In the kitchen, he filled quart-sized mason jar with sugar and scrounged 3 Tupperware jugs for mixing. They hauled the supplies outside, and Hunter went to the backyard shed for his little trailer. Jacob and Eric stacked the supplies under the trailer while Hunter tied it to his bike. Down a back alley, they found a wine crate and an old wooden chair. They set up shop on the main street in the parking lot of an old abandoned gas station across the street from McDonald's. On a piece of cardboard, Eric printed neatly in black felt pen, "Kool-Aid, 10 cents a glass." They used a string to tie it to the wine crate and agreed to share the chair at 10-minute intervals. After an hour, it seemed the only ones interested in the Kool-Aid were insects. They didn't sell 1 glass. Eric crossed out 10 and added 5, but that didn't help either. It took almost a whole afternoon to learn that getting a nickel for 10 cents worth of drink was no way to make money, and all they ended up with was a sunburn and a belly full of Kool-Aid and a $6 debt. That night, Deb and Anita were having a party at Hunter's house. With no Margaret around, they'd brought in all sorts of snacks: red wine, white wine, beer, and a bottle of Canada Club. "I want you to stay in the basement," Deb spoke in her "I'm in charge" voice and gave Hunter a brand new $2 bill. "Keep your mouth shut and you'll get another $2 after." And shortly after 7, the guests rolled in, and they were all ordered to leave their shoes on the landing. An hour later, the party was in full swing. Donna Summers was on the record player. The volume was cranked. Hunter put the $2 bill in his back pocket and tried to sleep, but the ceiling above his head undulated and groaned under the stress of 20 or more high school kids dancing up a storm. So he snuck out of the house to go for a walk. The stars shone bright, like little sparkling flecks of glass. The gravel under his worn runners jabbed at the soles of his feet, but the night air was warm and good. As he walked along the street, Hunter named out all the cars out loud, parked on the curbside: Ford, Chevy, Dodge, Mercury. 2 blocks later, outside Carol's house, he spotted the Pontiac, parked in a driveway, and crept up to the kitchen window. Country music crackled from a small AM radio at the center of the dining room table, where a couple of half-full glasses and empty bottles stood. He heard his mother's voice. "Well, Carol, I better get home, see what them damn kids of mine are up to. Boy, that house better be clean when I get there. Carol laughed and then called to her own teenagers. You girls, get out here. Clean up this goddamn mess or I'll kill you. Hunter didn't stick around. If Margaret was on her way home, he had minutes to warn Deb and her friends. He ran so fast that the wind gave him goosebumps, and he shivered as he bounded up the porch steps and swung the door open. He ran into the kitchen where Deb was pouring a rye and Coke. I thought I said stay downstairs. Hunter motioned for her ear, and she bent down. Mom's up the street at Carol's place, and she's on her way home. What? Really? No kidding. I wish I were. Deb strode to the record player where Anita was queuing up into the next song and whispered in her friend's ear. Anita's face turned stone gray. Then she killed the music. Deb yelled louder than Hunter had ever heard her. Party's over! My mom's coming home! Everybody knew what that meant. There had been a time last year when Margaret had been at her table at the Cut Thumb pub drinking with her buddies. Some white guy leaned into the table and said something to them. Then barely had time to blink. Margaret head faked him and hit him with an uppercut that broke his jaw. One shot. The poor bastard had to eat meat milkshakes for 6 weeks. One punch Maggie, her friends sometimes called her after that. OP for short. Hunter watched as Deb and Anita's panic induced a mad scramble to safety. Anita funneled the guests towards the open back door where Deb shoved them unceremoniously out. Hunter chuckled out loud. It was old-timey slapstick, he thought, as people bounced and fell over one another. Deb slammed the door on the last guest, and the two scurried about cleaning up the mess of empty bottles. Any leftover booze went into Deb's room. Deb and Anita and Hunter worked like an orchestra, piling the snacks into the living room coffee table and turning on the television. It flickered to life. The twilight zone was on. Hunter looked out the front window and saw Margaret, half a block away, staggering home. She's coming, I can see her. He looked at the landing. The guests had no time to retrieve their shoes. Deb, Hunter pointed. Get rid of them quickly, baby boy. While Deb washed dishes and Anita dried, Hunter threw all their shoes into the basement. From the other side of the front door, he heard Margaret open the gate. Her feet, a heavy clump, clump up the stairs. The knob squeaked as it turned. Locked. Moments later, her keys rattled. Just before she pushed the door open, Hunter followed the shoes into the basement. He heard Margaret's unsteady footsteps on the living room floor. What's going on here? Why are you guys still awake? And Deb's voice was calm. It's Saturday night. I'm having a sleepover with Anita. Hunter turned on his old nightlight and lay on his bed. And seconds later, someone knocked on the basement slider window. Hunter pulled up a chair and stood on it to reach the latch. And there stood a boy whose breath stank of booze and smelled of skunk wafted in his clothes. He was very polite. Hey, do you know where I can get my shoes back? Hunter thought for a moment. Do you have a quarter? He whispered, I'll find it for you. The boy fished out 2 dimes and a nickel. What kind of shoes? White Adidas, size 10, yellow laces. Hunter put the money in his pocket and searched for the shoes. The slightly drunk boy spread the word, and soon Hunter was making 2 bits for every pair of shoes. Within 10 minutes, he'd made $5 and given back all the shoes. He locked the window latch, returned the chair, and stowed the change in his purple bag hidden in his mattress. Still wearing his GWGs, he fell asleep to the voices of Margaret, Deb, and Anita mingling with Rod Serling's. There you go. So yeah, he was a really, really, resourceful character. And growing up, I don't know. Like, I mean, I'm a product of the '60s and the '70s, and growing up in a small town, we didn't have a lot of adult supervision. So we got away with a lot. We did a lot of stupid stuff, as kids. But most of it was in search of candy and and food and fun. And yeah, thank you all for coming out tonight. Any questions?
I think it's interesting how you're talking about you did this memoir and then you've pulled from the memoir to create this novel.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's really very interesting, and how to do that and make it a novel, although it's still part of the memoir, right? So.
It's very memoir. Well, it's almost creative nonfiction memoir in a way. You know, I mean, I got to have a lot of fun because like when you're writing memoir, you're so inside your own head. You know, you're not thinking, you're not head hopping. It's not an omniscient sort of perspective. You don't get to find out what people are thinking or saying inside their head. You have to assume. So when I turned it into the fiction, I got an opportunity to actually go inside other people's heads, if only for a little bit, just to sort of get outside of my own head. It was a really good exercise in separating the writer from the narrator. So when I finally figured that trick out and could write like that, then the writing became so much more fun and less of an arduous sort of, you know, exercise in trying to hide truth. You know what I'm saying? Like, because memoirs are all truth. It's really, really hard to write memoir without hurting yourself or other people. And so that's the slippery slope with memoir. One of the challenges with this particular book was Margaret, the mother figure, and trying to make her, you know, a better person, or seemingly a better person, right? Like, I think about my mother, you know, who had, you know, was a product of the Indian Act and grew up in the 30s and the 40s, and she's a part of the, you know, the silent generation, so she wasn't even a baby boomer, but the way that she grew up in the schools and on the reserve and just in general, the general Canadian sort of zeitgeist in the 50s and 60s and 70s, the justification of that was the Indian Act. And so in the very beginning of the story, the prologue, it talks about how she ended up where she was, where she ended up, you know, and that the system, the colonial system, the Indian Act, the welfare system, all of these systems that are put in place to govern Indigenous people were all there to kind of take us all away, because we ran away a lot. We hid a lot from the system. You know, if you saw that black car pull up to the house, everyone hid or ran, and that was just a you know, that was just life, right? You just instinct. Yeah. The other day I was talking. I did a talk at UBC, and we were talking after the event about it's trauma bonding is what they call it. It's when you have an eerily similar traumatic experience, and Indigenous people have this in spades. It seems like, you know, the government or the church or the police or any of the governing bodies out there didn't really change the playbook at all when it came to governing Indigenous folks. So like residential schools all had the same playbook, you know, day schools all had the same playbook, reserves all had the same playbook, and it was, you know, it didn't matter where you were in the country, you know, the protocol and the process for managing us was identical. So in that sense, you know, we do have that in common. So like, I mean, I can talk to almost any Indigenous person in any part of the country, and we can bond, we can trauma bond on that experience of what it was like to grow up in that system, you know. Yeah. Crazy. And look at me now. Who'd have thought, right? Like yeah.
I have a question about you now.
Okay.
Are you the Indigenous storyteller in residence at Vancouver Public Library?
I was, yeah. I did that.
I'd love to hear
yeah.
about that experience and the highlights and what it was like.
You know,
Cool.
it was really, really cool. And you know, when you're a newly emerged author and you're looking for that next, you know, that next little bit, that next step to take, you know, my method is put as many pokers into the fire as you possibly can, because you know, 9 times out of 10 you're going to get 0, maybe even more than that. 9.9 times out of 10 you're going to get 0. So it's best to put as many of these little pokers in the. And I'd filled out the application. I went through the whole process, and it takes a long time for these things to, you know, to be processed and for them to make their choices. And by that time, I'd completely forgotten that I'd even applied. So I got a phone call, and I was standing up. I was, you know, petting my cat. We're on the balcony, and you know, and I get this phone call, and I answer the phone, and then, you know, I get this, you know, is this Joseph? And I'm like, yeah, it's Joseph, you know, la 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 la. And we'd like you to be the Indigenous storyteller for Vancouver Public Library. And then that's when I said, just let me sit down for a second. So I sat down, and I was, you know, but it was as much as I built it up to be this ultimately massively stressful point in my life or time in my life, I had no idea what to expect. When I got there, it was the most chilled, laid back, you know, situation I've ever been in. Yeah, so supportive, and I got to do a lot of things with a lot of different communities. The downtown east side, I did the women's march, and I got to go to VGH and do a talk with the elders there, and I got to put on shows and do things that, you know, like, I mean, the interesting thing about this particular residency is I got the opportunity to do things that I would never have been able to do otherwise. You know, I had a budget, and I had you know, schedules, and I had 2 people, you know, working with me to kind of make sure that I was on time and everything was organized. It was really amazing. Had a top floor office, you know, it's all the resources. I mean, they printed out my entire I finished a 100,000 word manuscript there. So my next book I finished there, and I burnt out their printer. That was awesome. 326 pages, but I did it. They need a new printer on the 7th floor, but yeah, it was a really, really wonderful experience. Yeah, I highly recommend anybody who's, you know, thinking about it, just, you know, take a chance. You know, take a chance. That's a wonderful question. Thank you, Megan.
Sure, and you never know when any of those other little pokers in the fire might come back to you.
A couple of them already come back and sort of bit me when I wasn't ready. So I'm still working on scheduling that stuff out. But yeah, and it's funny, you know, like, I mean, when things like that happen to you, and you know, like, you publish a book, you runner up on something, or your short list, or your long list, or anything else like that. Like these little steps that you make as an artist, as a writer, or whatever, like they all mean something in the end. At the end of the day, you're one step closer to where you want to be, and that's what that was. It's you know, like, just one step, one little thing after the other, and you know, 3 or 4 years later, you know, here I am. You know, I'm going to be I'm the mentor for the Writers Trust of Canada for the fiction. And I just made my choice. I sent the emails off. I got a couple of more things to do before it comes public, but well, my choice anyways. And yeah, little things like this, right? Like, I mean, I probably wouldn't have gotten this particular gig if I hadn't have gotten, you know, the residency at VPL, you know. So yeah, you just never know. Take a chance. Take as many chances. Chances are free. You know, they really are. And sometimes you create your own chances by taking other chances. And you just never know what's going to lead to, right? I wrote a book. I never thought it would go where it went. And I never thought it would lead to, you know, a residency at VPL, you know. And I never thought it would lead to this. So yeah, it just goes to show you. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Any more questions?
Can I ask what's going to become of that manuscript? Is that a horror?
It is actually. It's a horror fantasy based in the Cree world. It's pretty gory. It's about a Wendigo named Victor Stormcloud. He's been around for 150 plus years. He's a special Wendigo who doesn't have a taste for anything other than bad people. He goes around exacting justice, you know, priests, crooked cops, bent politicians, things like that, nasty nurses or nuns and things like that, you know, like, so he's kind of an anti-hero. He's an indigenous anti-hero. And that one there is actually in the final editing process right now. I managed to find myself an indigenous editor who's familiar with the legends and the stories, and which really helps. And so there's not a lot of, you know, like explaining or describing, or, you know, like, I mean, they know exactly what I need to do for this, for the audience, that, you know your audience, right? And so thankfully I've you know, I'm finally at that stage. Hopefully I'll get at least the first 3 chapters ready for my agent in August, and then hopefully she'll like it, and then it'll go from there, and then it'll just go to the, you know, the place wherever agents take them, you know, and then sell it. And
The gods.
yeah, the gods, yeah, for sure. So yeah, the publishing gods, you know. But yeah, it's I had a lot of fun writing it. I'm having a lot of fun writing the second one. The second one, the main character is a young indigenous girl who's the daughter of a very magical being, and so she's kind of got the same job, but she's a lot different. She's more powerful, and she's angry, and, you know, so her mother is trying to, you know, so there's that relationship, but she's also meant to do something, she's, you know, so, and that's for the 3rd book, but I won't go there anymore. So yeah, it's a lot of fun. I was really struggling with the manuscript when I was at VPL, and then something occurred to me, why don't I just write the first chapter and the last chapter? Because I was having a really hard time finding out where the hell this particular act was going to end. And so I just wrote the last chapter where I thought I could see it ending, a good clean ending kind of thing, but a little bit of a cliffhanger, because I wanted to write the 3rd book. And then a lawyer friend of mine, I was describing this process with him, right? And he's like, oh yeah, us lawyers, we call that the meat sandwich method. You know, you have your ask, you know, you have your tell, and then you just fill in the middle with all the rest of the stuff. And I'm like, meat sandwich method. You know what, of all the school and education and English courses I've taken, I've never heard it called that. And that would have made perfect sense to me, you know, 20 years ago, you know? I know, you know, I don't know. Anyways, I'm going to have to talk to my English prof.
We could write it.
It's the meat sandwich method, guys. It really works. But yeah, it really does work, you know, because it allowed me to reverse engineer. You know, well, you know, I wrote the last chapter. Well, you know, the questions, that's when you ask the questions. Well, how did they get there? Why did they get there? When did they get there? Who? You know, like, I mean, it's a really wonderful way to sort of find out how, you know? So if you know the end of it, you can figure out the middle of it. So it just takes time. Reverse engineer. It comes to me at 3 o'clock in the morning sometimes. I keep a little notepad, you know, like, yeah. And then I'm up till, you know, 4 o'clock in the morning writing. And then I got to take a nap at 6 a.m., you know, because the cat kept me up and woke me up at 5 to feed her and do her kitty litter. And then, yeah. Anyways, it's a weird life, writing. You know, when you're writing full time, you don't get a lot of breaks, because you're always thinking, always looking for that new word, always searching for that line, you know. Yeah. Well, you know.
Yeah. I've spent too much time on my bike lately, though. So now I'm gonna write about it.
I hope you journaled.
I do sometimes, but this last experience was a race, and it was a self-supported bike race for 4,400 kilometers, and I'm pretty brain dead, and I can, like, I'm sending voice memos to
Yep.
So I think the voice memos are probably the easiest way to get the most
Yeah.
material out, and I guess it's a form of journaling. But
It is, yeah.
I don't
Yep.
think for me, I process stuff more when I'm writing it down versus when I'm spitting it out. So it's really
Yeah.
missing that extra process, but I think it is one step.
Yeah, that's actually I was at Banff in 2022, I think it was, and one of my mentors, Lawrence Hill, we were all sitting in this pub, having a really good old chat, telling stories. There was like 17 of us writers all sitting there, talking and whatever, and Lawrence was sitting there, and I was telling a story about, one of my courier stories from, like, and Larry had said, you should write that down. And I said, I can't write that down. I can't type that fast, And he's like, why don't you try you hit that little microphone button in the top right-hand corner of your Word document. And so I tried that, and it works great. It's fantastic. I was like, oh my God, I don't have to type anymore. This is so great. All of those typing courses I took in the 80s,
Useless now.
useless, completely useless, Oh my God. I was like the only guy in typing class too. I was the only guy in foods, and I took sewing. But I mean, they're practical skills, right? I can sew a button, I can fix my socks, and I can type 87 words a minute. So
There's that.
there is that. That got me a job at a library, not the sewing, but the typing, the sewing came later, yeah. It's amazing how many people knit in the library. Yeah. Anyways, yeah. No more questions?
I have one.
Sure.
Given that this started as memoir,
Mm.
I also noticed that it's classified as young adult fiction.
Mm-hmm.
So like, what do you consider it to be? Is it like young adult fiction, or is it more like a novel? I'm thinking of like, because I'm a Victorianist, like Dickens's David Copperfield or Great Expectations, where it's the adult reflection back on the childhood, right? That's more the adult fiction, whereas young adult fiction is like through the perspective of the youngster, but without that retrospective aspect to it.
It's not the first time I've heard it compared to Dickens or Sam Clements, kind of, sort of adventurous, sort of raucous, kind of, turbulent times, yada, yada, yada. But I think for me, in terms of age groups and genre, I do like it as a fiction. I would prefer a young adult, but that's only because I'm trying desperately to get it in to replace The Outsiders. Because as much as I like The Outsiders, no dissing S.E. Hinton or any whatever, but it is a product of its time, and I read part of it a few months back just because I needed to refresh my memory and all this, and there's some derogatory comments in it that would not fly in today's zeitgeist. So there is a bit of a push to get the book to replace The Outsiders. I've had a couple of, people I do book clubs for the book, and teachers, usually grade 10, grade 11, and grade 12 teachers are picking it up and looking at it for their syllabus, so for the fall. So yeah, I like I said, I just think that the high school syllabus needs to change.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a selfish question. I teach children's literature at the college.
Yeah.
And so I'm always keeping my
Yeah.
ear open for different choices. to
Yeah.
implement for my
Yeah.
students.
Yeah. One of the challenges, though, when they say when you're writing your book, you need to, choose the hills you're going to die on carefully,
Yeah.
right? When your editor tells you to, and your publisher says, this needs to change, we don't have an arc, we need this, you need to connect that, you need to fill this in, then you do it. But if they say the swearing might be a problem, not that they care, but if we're trying to get this into, to schools, the obscenities can be a challenge. The problem is like in 1976, 75, I was swearing like a sailor. I mean, there wasn't a kid in my school that didn't swear like a sailor. That was some of the first language we learned. I mean, we learned it so well. We knew it in French and Cree and English. We could swear in 3 different languages. Every kid could. Every white kid, every native kid. It didn't matter who you were. If you lived in that town, you knew when somebody was telling you to in Cree or in French. So the idea of making the kids talk, without swearing every now and again, was not being truthful to the time or to the story that I wanted to write.
Well, they were talking like kids, right?
Yeah. And so that was the one hill that I said no. Like, we wanted it to get the First Nations Community Reads Award. It did get that. I was actually quite surprised that it did get that award because, I mean, historically speaking, the language has usually been a bit of a barrier. And most times whenever I'd spoken to editors or submitted short stories with this kind of, tone to it, they usually came back, if they weren't rejected, they were completely rejected with lines through it saying, this is unbelievable. There's no way a kid could talk like that at age 10. And I'm like, they have never spent any time on the reserve. I tell you, like, I mean, everybody knows how to swear. You're 4 years old, man. You know how to swear at 4 years old. You also know how to make your bed and cook your own dinner at 4 years old, right? Like, that's how I grew up. So like, I mean, there was something illegitimate and something not quite valid when you dumb down the language. And I just, that's the hill I died on, and I'm glad that I fought that one, because the book ended up winning the award anyways. And so poker's in the fire, right? You just never know what's going to come up. Yeah.
Have you heard any feedback since the book has been published from people saying like, oh, I loved it, but like the swearing offended me or anything like that?
I have heard a couple of things, but mostly from people who are religious. And like, I mean, and I get it, right? Like, I mean, it's like, I mean, it's probably not going to get into any Christian schools, and that's fine with me. I'm not shooting for the Christian schools. I'm going for public schools because, I mean, that's where my heart is, Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I'm stoked to read it. I'm really excited.
I can't wait to read your book. And I mean, is it here? Can I purchase a copy of it? Yeah. Okay. Excellent.
Probably so,
Yeah.
1 or 2.
Good.
1 or 2 of everybody's in
Good.
there.
Yeah. I'm gonna pick up a copy of that. And yeah. I'm gonna listen to the language that you're using, describing writing, because I have a short story that I wrote about being a bicycle courier in Vancouver, and it's a really, really, the industry back in the 80s and 90s was really, really seedy underbelly kind of, like, I mean, nobody liked us, and they all thought we were dirt bags and addicts, and they weren't wrong. But most of us were addicted to something, and most of us didn't care what the system thought of us, and we just, we're looking to make our $150 a day and, hopefully finish by noon. But yeah, it's when I was a bicycle courier, many a day were spent, smoking copious amounts of marijuana and, doing the odd bag of mushrooms and, a couple of tabs of acid, and then you just get on your bike and ride around the city and be some, crazy courier guy, right? So I wrote a story about that. And I took a bunch of, experiences that I had as a bicycle courier, and I called the story "A Day in the Life of a Bicycle Courier." And it's just some of these things you would never think that they would actually happen, but they do. The weirdest things, the weirdest happens when you're a bicycle courier. You know, it wasn't the LSD. It wasn't the LSD. No, no. Somebody actually got me to pick up 50 pounds of salmon from a restaurant on Robson Street and take it to a law firm, you know, across town. And yeah, on my bicycle, just, you know. Okay, whatever. It was a rush, so, you know, I got paid double, so I didn't care. You know, but it was 50 pounds of salmon. It's a lot of weight, you know, putting that in my bag, you know. I'm sure there was little bits and pieces of something, you know, like, you know how, you know, your bag, at the bottom of the bag, it's got to, you know, so when I pulled it out of the bag, you know, I just sort of threw it on this table and all this came out on top of it. It was Christmas. They let me get away with it. So, but yeah, anyways. So I'm thinking about language, writing language. Well, this has been an absolute pleasure. Total slice. Yeah.
Thank you so much for making time, and thank you guys for coming.
Yes, thank you all for coming out tonight. We really do appreciate that.
So don't feel like you have to rush if you want to chat
Mhm.
and visit and stuff.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Yeah. Yeah, and if you want to pick up my book or Megan's book, you know, I'm sure we can, you know, accommodate that and yeah, sign if you need, if you want, you know.